Hello everyone and welcome to the third installment of the error exploration series where we'll be discussing insufficient and additional ink errors as well as missing print layers. Let's start by getting into the applicable parts of the printing process. As mentioned in the previous video, printing plates pick up ink and transfer it to the blanket roller so it can be applied to the sheet. We'll be taking a deeper dive into plates as they play an integral part in the errors that will be featured today. There is one printing plate for each print layer, that being one or two white layers when applicable, cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and clear ink. Back in the Neo era, there was a separate metallic ink layer for the metal types, but that's a very nuanced exception. Printing plates are slightly larger than the sheets they're responsible for transferring ink to, and are commonly made of aluminum, plastic, or different composite materials. Areas of the plate that are intended to pick up ink are called image areas, and have a special coating that the ink will adhere to. Everywhere on the plate that isn't supposed to pick up ink is a non-image area, instead picking up a solution, mostly made up of water, in order to repel ink. For clarity on this subject, the solution and the ink are supposed to mix to some degree and hold each other together. This is called emulsification. However, fluctuations in the ink to water ratio will lead to significant issues. Now that we've gone over the basics of how a printing plate works, we can take a quick look at the ink fountain found on each unit of a printing press. On some printing presses, the ink fountain has ink replenished manually, whereas on others a cartridge is inserted that feeds ink down onto the roller. As the ink starts to near being fully depleted, the affected print layer can appear to fade as the color is no longer applied as densely as intended. Some degree of fluctuation in the density of each color is to be expected across print runs, regardless of whether the ink is running low. The last topic to address before tackling the errors themselves is progressive printing. Prior to a print run, separate print layers in isolation and in different combinations will be printed onto sheets. These are called progressives, but if viewed by the community would be referred to as test sheets. As an example, a sheet may be printed with only cyan ink, just cyan and black but no other colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow but no black, etc. These progressive proofs can be referenced during a print run to ensure quality is maintained, but also serve to ensure that there are no issues with individual layers prior to full-scale printing, with the print layers being the correct density and blending properly, among other things. If you enjoy these in-depth explanations, please like and subscribe. I do a good amount of research to make sure my information is correct prior to making these videos. Alright, seeing as we've gained the necessary knowledge for this video, let's start off the errors with additional ink. These errors can occur for several different reasons, but the printing lingo used to describe the main reason is scumming, meaning that non-image areas of the plate become receptive to ink. There are a number of poorly maintained factory conditions that can lead to this issue, but in most cases, the problem is too little solution being applied to the plate, thus allowing ink to be picked up in non-image areas. Alternatively, a glob of ink can make its way in between the rollers, which leaves a distinct mark that resembles a large printer hickey, with a ring around it where the blanket and printing plate were separated by the blob, and thus no ink was transferred, with a broken up patch in the middle like what is seen on Mawile and Sharpedo from Obsidian Flames. Another common cause is ink left over on the rollers from a previous print run getting applied to sheets where it isn't intended. Take this Shaman with Jerry Judy printed on it, for example, although this may be classed as a separate error entirely, seeing as the additional ink is actually legible. Additional ink errors can seemingly occur to any of the print layers and appear in many different forms depending on the conditions. Some cards will even have multiple colors of additional ink. The most unique of the different additional ink errors would be additional white ink, as it results in the holofoil being hidden. These cards visually resemble missing holofoil errors, but will often have splotches where the holofoil shows through, a ring on the borders where the additional ink stops and the foil is visible, and will be heavier when compared to a missing holofoil copy of the same card. Some additional white ink errors can cause the entire card to be fully non-holo. These are more difficult to tell apart from cards that are missing the foil layer. On Wizard of the Coast era cards, additional ink will generally take the form of what looks like overspray on the card's surface, or vertical bars running down the face of the card, which are more noticeable in the art box. However, while there are a wide variety of additional ink errors, be careful not to be fooled by cards that are simply stained by a kid spilling their juice, or drawing on them with the marker. Marks like this can stand out when tilted in the light as being over the gloss instead of under it, appear to have related water damage, affect both sides of the card, or be visible on the edge of the card, all of which show it is something that happened post-production rather than being an error. Back to the error at hand, PSA will not label additional ink errors, generally treating them as normal cards, whereas CGC will properly grade them as additional ink. Next up, we have insufficient ink errors, where, as you may have guessed, an insufficient amount of ink reaches the sheet. Like additional ink errors, these occur for a number of reasons that are not limited to the ink running low. However, the other common instance would be too much solution being applied to the printing plate, leading areas to appear washed out, non-uniform, or leaving gaps in the print layer. Generally, insufficient ink specifically refers to instances where a color is faded evenly across the card, whereas cards that have a section that appears washed out may be considered as liquid obstructions, like this gibble. On the subject of obstructions, some can visually resemble insufficient ink errors like this card here, but typically they can be distinguished as affecting part of a card rather than the entirety, and often they'll affect multiple print layers as opposed to insufficient ink errors which affect one. As is the case with additional ink errors, insufficient ink errors can occur to any of the print layers. Because the colors on cards are produced with CMYK, some features of a card will be different colors than normal if the colors don't blend as intended, hence the difference between these Maridon cards. On one side, we have insufficient cyan, and on the other, insufficient magenta, with a regular copy in the middle for comparison. You may notice that while this next card has an insufficient black ink error, some of the blacks on the card are unaffected. That's because some of the black you see on this card, the energy symbols for example, are printed with a blend of cyan, magenta, and yellow, instead of black ink. Now that we've gone over what this error looks like with regard to CMYK, let's discuss insufficient white ink, more specifically the white ink intended to hide the holofoil on parts of a card. Holo Bleed is the community term for these errors, but not all Holo Bleed is indicative of an error. Cards from Diamond and Pearl and neighboring eras were commonly printed with a relatively thin opaque layer, thus allowing the holofoil to show through. Due to how common they are, this is generally considered to be more of a design choice than an error. Modern holos will have a degree of holo bleed when viewed under a strong light, and this is perfectly normal. In order for a company like CGC to recognize holo bleed as an insufficient ink error, it has to be quite severe and uniform across the card, as you can see on this Mewtwo, which could potentially be missing the opaque layer entirely. To quickly touch on a relatively common issue you'll see on modern textured ultra rares, they can have this splotchy look when viewing the card in the right lighting. This is considered insufficient ink by CGC. It likely stems from the ink to water ratio trending slightly more towards the water on the white opaque layer, thus leaving it washed out. PSA will grade some, quote, missing ink errors, but they don't fit within the general definition we're going for here. Those more so fit under the liquid obstruction umbrella, so PSA doesn't quite label insufficient ink errors. I have recently seen them grading what they call incomplete print layer errors though, but not in this context. On the contrary, CGC will grade them as insufficient ink as expected. Before we move on to the last error category, I'd like to touch on a very common subject that comes up with error cards: sun fading. People will commonly see Wizard of the Coast cards with faded borders and assume that they're errors, when in fact the borders on many Wizard of the Coast cards simply fade faster than the other print layers, turning noticeably pink before any other part of the card changes color. Over time, magenta and yellow will fade to a point where they're unnoticeable, but black and cyan don't noticeably fade. For this reason, it is wise to be suspect of cards that appear low on or completely missing yellow and magenta while maintaining black and cyan. However, to confuse matters, there are genuine errors on modern cards where both the magenta and yellow ink are missing, with the most common examples being seen on the back of Crown Zenith Galarian Gallery cards, the front of Scarlet and Violet base holo cards, the front of French or German 151 commons, and the front of French Paldea Evolved reverses, among other examples. When looking closely at the dot matrix on the surface of a sun-faded card, often a color will not be entirely missing or inconsistently faded. thus indicating that what you're looking at may not be a genuine error. Shifting focus over to the final error in this episode, which we just discussed briefly, we have missing print layer and subsequently missing print layers errors. These errors occur when one or more print layers are missing from either side of the card, potentially being caused by a number of different factors. Hypothetically, the ink for a specific unit can fully run out or never get loaded in to begin with, thus leaving no ink for the plate to pick up and transfer to the sheet. Moreover, a foreign object could fully block one or more print layers from reaching certain cards on a sheet. However, it's more likely that the missing print layer errors you see come out of Crown Zenith and certain Scarlet and Violet sets, especially those printed with only cyan and black, are actually progressive proofs that erroneously got cut up and inserted into packs. Generally, in order for a card to be considered a missing print layer error, the layer or layers have to be completely absent upon close inspection, with allowance for some small parts of the dot matrix which may simply receive ink left over from a previous run. A very slight layer of ink being present should denote an insufficient ink error instead. PSA will seemingly grade these as incomplete print layer errors, whereas CGC will grade them as missing print layer or missing print layers errors, depending on whether one or more color is absent. That about wraps up what I wanted to cover today. It will actually wound up being a lot more than I initially planned to talk about. I went into this thinking only covering 3 errors would make a very short video, but I failed to think about all the nuances with these particular errors beforehand. Please feel free to enjoy my other videos, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos to the Error Exploration series. I'll see you all in the next video.